Morning, Rabbi.
Good morning. Okay. Let's go back here. And I will bring up the screen.
Morning, Rabbi.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Okay, I just want to remind you all that if you don't get a copy of the text in a PDF file, you're welcome to email me and I'll be happy to send it to you. Probably would be easier for us if you have it. Just give me 1 sec. All right. So good morning, everyone. We had started the piece in the Likutim. The Likutim section is, Likutim literally means collections of different cases, and what it means, collection of cases. But it's, kind of questions. So yesterday, we had started to see a case of where a person would not have to be cursed with Mishpat because circumstances changed. Let's say a person was in the market to buy an object, and lo and behold, after he had put money down, he came into this object as an inheritance. And so in that situation, we would not impose the curse of Mishpat upon him, because he really does have a legitimate reason why he has to go back on the deal. What I'd like to do is look at another case in the Likutim. This is on line 5. Let's see. Or actually, we can go to the second line and take a look at this next case. Im Gomar Hamekach Bidvarim Bilvad. Let's say Reuven enters into an oral contract with Shimon. V'achar kach mocher l'sheni al yidei kabolas mos sheyesh bo mishapara. And then he turns around to Levi and accepts Levi's down payment for the object. So what he did was not ethical, okay, because he had already committed to sell it to Reuven, but he turns around to Levi and he says, I'll sell it to you, give me a down payment. Mistaver de mishapara chomer tvei. It seems like the lesser of two evils, is to go with the second buyer, and therefore it would trump sort of the obligation that he had to Reuven, with whom he had an oral contract. So, in other words, we're talking about a b'diavad situation where he had made an oral commitment to party A, and then took money from party B, even though what he did was incorrect. But looking at it as far as how to correct it in a b'diavad situation, he would have to follow through with B because he already had accepted his money. Even though in both cases the sale is not consummated because the buyer has not taken physical possession of the goods, but we have to look at which one made more of a step towards the purchase, and therefore we would award it to B. Okay?
So Rabbi, even though the chronology is that the first buyer was the oral agreement, and you think the first thing that he did would be more important, it's the deposit that really carries the day.
Correct. Right. You see from what his argument is, that because remember, A person who goes back on his oral commitment is what's called a mechusar amana. He's acting in bad faith, but he doesn't get a curse. The person who accepts cash and then goes back on the deal actually can be cursed in Beis Din. So you see that if he were to go back on the second deal, that would be far more offensive than if he were to go back on the first deal. And therefore it's more important for him to follow through on the second deal and be called acting in bad faith than to actually have a curse imposed upon him. Exactly. Okay, and we're going to see more about this idea of acting in bad faith shortly. Okay, yesh lefa'amim she'ma'ot konot de'emidu divreihem al din Torah. There are certain circumstances where the Chachamim did not institute the rabbinic principle that payment of cash does not consummate the deal. Remember, we had learned that really midioraisa, once a buyer pays the money, he has consummated the deal and the object belongs to him. But the rabbis stepped in and they said, no, we're concerned about the welfare of the buyer. And if we were to allow the sale to be consummated after giving the money, but he hasn't yet taken possession, the seller may be not as careful to protect the object that is no longer his, that is in his physical possession, and may allow things to occur to it like a fire burning it down and so forth. So they said that the buyer does not fully acquire it until he actually takes physical possession. But there are times when as we'll show you in the Shulchan Aruch in just a minute, there are times when the Chachamim said no, money does consummate the deal. And this is actually a sif in Shulchan Aruch, which I'm going to show to you now. Let me just bring it up. Okay, does everyone see this now on my screen? Where it says Sif Gimel. Does everyone see that? This is from Choshen Mishpat, Simin Kuf Tzadi Tes Sif Gimel. This is a section in the actual Shulchan Aruch itself, and it's talking about laws of sales and purchases. Hilchos Mekach Umemkar. Okay? And the Shulchan Aruch writes as follows. Yesh zman shema'os konas. There are times when payment of cash completes the deal. She'emidu chachamim divreim al din Torah bebasar be'arba'a prakim. That the chachamim stood on Torah law and forwent, if that's the right word, they forgave the rabbinic institution when it comes to purchasing meat in 4 instances. Why specifically meat? Because meat is a perishable item. And once the buyer puts down money, there's a certain reliance from both ends, as you'll see in just a second. The Eluheim, the 4 instances are as follows, or 4 periods, or 4 junctures in time. Erev Yom Tov ha'acharon shel Chag, if it's the eve of Shmini Atzeres, the Erev Yom Tov Harishon Shel Pesach, if it's the eve of Pesach, the Erev HaAtzeres, the eve of Shavuos, the Erev Rosh Hashanah, and the eve of Rosh Hashanah. And he explains, She'im haya latabach shor shaveh mea dinarim, that if the butcher, and the word butcher over here doesn't just mean the guy who receives the side of beef, but refers to a guy who owns cattle and slaughters it and then dismembers the animal and sells it. That if this fellow, the butcher, has a cow or a steer, right, and the cow is worth even 100 dinars, which is $10,000, whatever its value is. V'lokach mehelokeach dinar kidei litein lo basar kishiyishchot, and he takes even 1 dinar from the buyer, because the buyer said, I need meat for Yom Tov, and I want you to give me you know, let's say 5 pounds of meat, and the butcher takes the cash, velonis kapsulo koldeme hashor, and then lo and behold, by the arrival of Erev Yom Tov, the butcher has not yet accumulated enough cash to sell off the entire animal. In other words, let's say the animal's worth 100 dinars, and he's only collected 60 dinars worth of customers. And so Nebuch, the guy, says, I'm going to lose money on this shechita because I don't have enough customers to sell the meat to. I'm going to be stuck with 40 dinars left of meat that I'm going to be stuck with in the animals, and it's not going to be sellable afterwards. But nonetheless, mashchitin oso ba'al korcho kidei litein habasar lalokeach. We nonetheless impose upon the butcher that he is obligated to slaughter the animal because he's already accepted the cash. Lefichach im meis hashor meis lalokeach umafsid hadinar. Now, so the argument is that we impose the obligation upon the butcher. You must slaughter the animal because there's a certain sense of reliance that is upon you that your customers have. He says, and even though the butcher is going to take a loss, and as the Sama says, he says, even though he's not going to have people left over to purchase the surplus meat. And so that's the reason, is because since it's Erev Yom Tov and everyone needs meat for Yom Tov, you don't have a right to keep the buyer hanging. Once he put down his money, the rabbi said, the animal is sold, or the portions of the animal, as it were, are now the property of the buyer, and the seller doesn't have a right to say that he's not going to shecht it. He's decided not to shecht it. And the reason is because you've made a commitment to these people that they need to have meat in order to have a proper yontif. But on the flip side, if, however, let's say what would happen is the 2 days before yontif, the shochet, the butcher has been holding this steer in his backyard, and Nebuch, coyote, came along and attacked the cow, because he lives in Thornhill, of course. A coyote came along, attacked, or a pack of coyotes came along, or killer wasps came along and killed the cow, and now the cow is dead. So the customers come and they say, do you have the meat? And he says, no, I'm terribly sorry, but the cow that I was going to be shechting has died. Well, then give me my money back. Oh no, you were a partial owner in that cow because you had already put the money down. So it's a bilateral liability in cases where we say ma'os konos, in cases where we say that the payment of the money consummates the purchase. On the one hand, it's to benefit the buyer, because this way now the seller cannot back out of the deal on Erev Yontif and say, I've decided I don't have enough customers, I'm not selling you the meat. But at the same time, there's no longer any liability on the seller to make restitution to the buyer if something happens to the purchase, if something happens to the cow. And so that's the general rule, is that there are certain times when it comes to meat purchases where there's a great sense of reliance on the meat for Yontif, and therefore the rabbi said the mos or konos. And then the Ramah says, and he expands this rule not just to meat purchases, but he says whenever it comes to mitzvah purchases that are like that, the same thing will hold true. The Ramah says, V'yesh mi shekasav, dehu hadin hanosing mos al yayin lekiddush be'erev Shabbos dekana dechol kahagavna hemidu divreim al din Torah. The Maharil writes that in all instances where there's a reliance, because it's Erev, it's the eve of a holy day where I'm going to do a mitzvah, So then the same thing is going to apply. And as the Choshen writes, he says the same thing would be true if you gave money, a payment to a baker to purchase challahs, because since you need those challahs potentially to make kiddush as well, because again, you're going to be using the wine for a mitzvah to make kiddush, and potentially you're going to be using challahs as well to make kiddush if a person doesn't have wine. In all instances where you're making a purchase of an object that you're going to do a mitzvah with, then, and it's a timely mitzvah, such that there's a great reliance that the buyer has on the seller to obtain those goods in order to do the mitzvah that is time sensitive. So then payment of money consummates the deal, and the seller does not have the right to back out on the deal. So
Rabbi,
yes.
just a question on that. Just getting back to the thing with the cow. So if the seller doesn't have to, if something happened to the cow dies, but he got the money back, he got a down payment. Like, doesn't the law of the land also come into play here? Because in the law of the land, you would say that the buyer has the right to get his deposit back because he didn't get the goods.
I don't know that's necessarily the law of the land. It might be industry specific. I don't know when it comes to commodities like pork bellies and stuff like that. If a person invests in the pork belly market and the pork belly market goes belly up, do we say that he is entitled to his that same amount of pork bellies? I don't think so. In other words, it's very industry specific. So you have to. I don't know the commodities market well enough to be able to tell you under what conditions the buyer has consummated the deal or not. But you're right. In all of these halachic instances, one would have to take into account the law of the land. But when it comes, but here we're dealing with exchanges between Jewish sellers and buyers that are related to the performance of a mitzvah, and that's the reason why specifically probably the law of the land might not apply. But we'll have to get into, when we get into the whole principle of when do we say dina de malchus dina, and when do we not say dina de malchus dina, maybe we'll get more into that. So it's a fair question.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
I don't think they had Pesach programs in the time of the Shulchan Aruch, but let's assume they did. And along came coronavirus. So now I've paid for my Pesach program and my Seder, and I've paid for everything. And along came coronavirus, or the hotel that we were going to burn down, or whatever the case is. Is this comparable?
I think it is comparable, but only to the extent that it's Erev Yontif. What happens if the program shuts, if coronavirus strikes 2 weeks before Pesach? So then I don't think that this halacha applies. Then we would say, Mos Einan Konos. Then we would say that, this is the crux of the Shaila as to what to do in situations like a Pesach program where the person running the program has already invested huge amounts of money and has taken down payments from his customers in order to be able to make a deposit on the hotel, and do other planning and advertising and programming and things like that. So all of these things it becomes very complicated, because ultimately it's not just a matter of purchasing the cow to shech for the customers. This is about, there's multiple vendors involved. Many of them are not Jewish. There are multiple different kinds of contracts, some of which are where the deposit is non-refundable for the person running the program, such as the down payment that he makes on the hotel. A lot of it so it becomes very complicated. And that's why usually what ends up happening is that it's somewhere in between, where I know for a number of these Pesach programs. By the way, was there any Pesach program that ran this year? Does anyone know of any Pesach program that ran this year? Probably not. So you have...
I think, Rabbi, they switched to delivering food from the Pesach program that was intended to the participants.
Interesting.
Yeah.
What I have heard with some of the programs is that the the person running the program would refund, let's say, 80% of the deposit, but kept 20% in order to prevent himself from complete financial ruin, because he had already laid out significant funds in order to pay all of his vendors who were not able to provide a refund to him. And it's like there's a whole chain of investors that, and vendors that is involved in such an enterprise. So it's really, you could apply this halacha if the fellow had already purchased the meat and it was Erev Yantiv, and now let's say the government shuts down the program and the guy can't make good on the meat. Or like Paul said, he can say, well, I have all of this meat, you're welcome to come pick it up, but I can't run the program for you. Okay.
So I'm still not really clear about the timing. So if the cow dies 2 days before Yontif, then this law doesn't apply. It's only if it happens Erev Yontif. Is that what we're saying?
It seems that way. It seems that the Shulchan Aruch says it's only when it's very, very time sensitive that we would say that the buyer is not entitled to a refund because it's Erev, it's the guy's mamish waiting to do the mitzvah that day or that evening, where there's such a level of reliance that you can't say that, well, the deal hasn't been consummated, so either party, the seller can back out at the last minute. Seller can't back out at the last minute. If it's 2 days before Yantiv, the seller can back out and he can return everyone's money. There may be a mishapara in that case, right? Because the buyer is going to be disappointed, but at least the buyer has a right, has the ability to try and figure out some other vendor that he can find to be able to sell him a piece of meat for Yantiv. So, but just getting back to this Ramah, so the Ramah essentially has told us that if there's a time-sensitive mitzvah that like it's Erev Shabbos, and I've already paid for a bottle of wine, and now the wine seller wants to back out of the deal, he doesn't have a right to do so because it's time sensitive, and I need that wine for a mitzvah. So there, the Chachamim said, we're going to go back to the biblical standard, which is that the wine actually legally belongs to the buyer. Okay, so if you take a look in the, so that's what I wanted you to see from there. And so now if you take a look back at the...
One more question, Rabbi, about the onus of care. I know it gets into Shomer kind of questions, but I mean, I presume that the seller can't be negligent in how he looks after the cow.
Right.
So
Right.
there's still an aspect there.
There's a presumption of him that he has to be a proper shomer, but he's basically considered to be a shomer chinam probably at this point, in which case he's not liable for theft and for fire and things like that, right? But he would be liable if, let's say, he was a posheya, if he was completely negligent and he left the gate open for the cow to run away. So getting back, so now let's look, now we understand the source in the Shulchan Aruch, and he says, Yesh lefa'amim she ma'os konos dehemidu divreim al din Torah. There are times when just the payment of money does consummate the deal, because the rabbis withdrew their sort of change of the biblical law. He says, so for example, it's also brought down by the Pri Megadim, if a person pays money for an esrog, and he comes Erev Yantiv to pick it up, and the seller tells him, oh, I'm sorry, I sold out all my merchandise, here's your money back. So that's the seller does not have a right to do. Seller does not have the right to say to him, sorry, you didn't pick up your esrog, so I needed to get rid of my merchandise, so I sold it all. No, it's Erev Yantiv. Legally, the esrog was mine. You had to save an esrog for me. The davka b'mitzvah shuhu tarud, but that's specifically with a mitzvah where there's time sensitivity, and there's the concern that there won't be time in the day for the buyer to scramble to find another seller. That's why the Chachamim said that the seller is not allowed to back out. Aval b'sha'ar mitzvah kagon tefillin bazeh mos einam konos. But when it comes to other mitzvahs, so for example, let's say I put down money for my son's tefillin for his bar mitzvah, but the bar mitzvah is a month away, and there's no time sensitivity involved in that, right? So it's not a time sensitive mitzvah as much as, let's say, Erev Yom Tov or Erev Shabbos. So in that situation, the seller does have the legal right to back out of the deal if, let's say, he decides he's going to sell the tefillin to somebody else, or he decides not to ship in the tefillin. He can turn back to the buyer and say, here's your money back. I'm sorry, I know that I committed to sell you a pair of tefillin, but in this case, I do have a legal right to back out of the deal. You may have a right to impose a curse upon him of mishapara, but in this situation, even though it's a mitzvah involved, but it's not a time-sensitive mitzvah, so there we would say that mos einam konos, that the deal is not consummated until physical possession of the tefillin is taken. Okay, let's skip a couple of lines and take a look at the next case. Yesh omrin, there are those who say, Dahani dekani esrog lemitzvah upari la'achar hachag lo yeos avdi. There are some poskim who write that if you take buy an esrog on credit, that you're not doing the right thing. Why are you not doing the right thing? The chol kama de lo yahib demei lo kani elamidirabanan. He says, because think about it, as so long as you have not yet paid the cash, you've only purchased rabbinically because you've taken physical possession of the object, but you haven't yet put down any money. So you've rabbinically, you have a legal acquisition of the esrog, but it's only by rabbinical law that you acquired this esrog, not by biblical law by paying the money. So you've acquired the esrog on credit, but you're not the biblical owner. Va'anan ba'inon lachem mid'oraisa, and the Torah says that on the first day of Sukkot, ulakachtem lachem bayom harishon, you have to take for yourself. It has to be legally yours on the first day of Sukkot. It has to be legally your esrog, your lulav and esrog, on the first day of Sukkot. Now it is legally yours, but only mid'orabanan. Mid'oraisa, it's not legally yours because you haven't yet paid cash for it. So therefore, it's not correct to purchase something on credit. Now, what would that mean as far as buying a lulav and esrog with a credit card? So this is something that some of the modern day poskim discuss, whether it's appropriate to purchase a lulav and esrog with a credit card. So he says, Imlo shehiviu lirishuso v'kanahu b'toras chatzer. So he says, well, there's another way out of this, which is that halachically, you are the biblical owner of the object, even if you haven't paid money, so long as you bring it into your domain. He says, and therefore, what really would be better is lechatchila for you to pay, make sure that the vendor is completely paid before the chag. Omnam b'derech klal ein adavar matzi l'maiseh deharei aderech lahaviu l'rshuso kodem kiyum hamitzvah. He says, but the reality is that even just bringing it into your home makes you the legal owner biblically, and therefore there's not much to worry about. Furthermore, there are many poskim who say that when you buy something on credit, when you pay with a credit card, the vendor has received his money. And what you now have created is a loan with a Gentile individual. So therefore you do become the legal owner because the money has been paid, not necessarily from you to the vendor, but from a third party to the vendor. And therefore that constitutes a legal biblical sale as well. So in general, it's just an interesting thought experiment. If a vendor was to give you an esrog on credit without requiring any payment at all, not even a credit card payment, then there might be a shaila. And that you have to make sure that you pay for your esrog before Sukkot, either through cash, check, or credit. But in some way, you need to make sure that the seller has acquired his payment before at least lechatchila.
Rabbi, those Rabbeim who have an issue or have a question with regards to using a credit card, would they have the same issue if I pay cash but I'm drawing it from a line of credit?
No, there wouldn't be, because then because the cash that you've now taken is now legally yours. It's just that you've generated a debt as a result of it. So it would seem pretty clear that in that situation where the money is going straight from you to the seller, I don't think anyone could have a problem with that. Okay, next.
When we were going through the holidays that it was Erev, did we say Erev Sukkot as well, or did we? I'm trying to. We did
No, it
4.
didn't include Erev Sukkot for some strange reason. I don't know why. Probably because there's a greater imperative of having basar on the eve of Shmini Atzeres. I haven't really looked into that
Right,
carefully.
because as you listed them, I was wondering about that.
Yeah.
Seemed like it stood out as an exception.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to have to get going, Rabbi Sai. I have another shir in half an hour. So I just want to wish you a wonderful day. And we'll see you near Choshen tomorrow.